Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again, this is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. I generally use this introduction to the program by saying a few words about the subject of the program. First, I record the three portions, and then I prepare the introduction. But this week I had recorded the program already, and I heard the news that our Prime Minister, Netanyahu, held a press conference, and he said he no longer sees any chance of forming a government. He's been given the task of forming a government by the president because his party, the Likud, received the most votes in the last election. Instead, he would seek to have a law passed that would result in direct election of the prime minister. Israel tried this back in the 1990s. It didn't work out too well. Israel has suffered through 4 elections in 2 years, which is really a disgrace. Each election costs a fortune, and the money could certainly be used for better purposes. Now we might be heading for a 5th election. This is an embarrassment, and I heard the news, too late to discuss it on the program. What I will talk about is the effect of the closing of the Suez Canal for more than a week on Israel's import and export, and the effect particularly on the export of farm products. I also discussed the fact the United States will resume giving money to the Palestinian Authority, which uses some of the money to reward terrorists. This funding was cut off by the Trump administration. Now it's being renewed. This could lead to further confrontation with the Biden administration, which already shows signs of doing things that are not good for Israel, like going back into the nuclear agreement with Iran. That was signed during the Obama administration when Biden was vice president. It was discontinued under the Trump administration. So we'll see how all these things will work out. We're apparently in a very difficult time. Good news is Israel's pretty much out of the COVID lockdown. The kids are going back to school. I'll be back after the break.
The return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel was prophesied in the Bible thousands of years ago and is coming true today. Shalom. Join me, Josh Wander, on Israel Unplugged. Listen in as we delve into the spiritual and physical aspects of the Jewish return to Zion. We'll discuss the biblically mandated, historic, and of course practical understandings of this incredible transition from exile to redemption. That's Israel Unplugged, every Monday on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. There are several problems developing within the United States that I want to address. There is a current lightly veiled danger challenging Israel's viability because the Joe Biden administration took some unexpected steps appearing to excuse Iran's agenda of developing weapon capability, agreeing to remove sanctions that to date have kept the endgame in check. America may have unconsciously contributed to destabilizing this region, which is always a difficult region. Within Lebanon, for example, Israel's northern neighbor, there is a large cache of technically sophisticated missiles and rockets estimated at over 100,000, while a lesser amount of similar weaponry is allegedly within Gaza. Both these areas are under the support of Iran and its regional proxies, Hezbollah and Hamas. To all three, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iran, have posed an active threat that should never have been allowed to progress to this magnitude. And as a result, our Prime Minister spoke to the American president, and according to reports, our Prime Minister said that Israel is a sovereign and independent country, and we reserve for ourselves all the options to behave as we see fit. Israel isn't in the same situation as the United States. Iran threatens to destroy Israel, and therefore it is an existential threat, something which is not a threat to the United States. So apparently we're developing difficulties with the Biden administration because they're going soft on Iran, something which the Trump administration was not. Now I want to talk about something else. As far as the American Jews, in the past half decade, there is anti-Israelism has been growing on college campuses across the United States. It targets pro-Israel Jewish students and faculty members and speakers brought to educate anybody willing to listen to discuss the truth about Israel and the Middle East. In the beginning, the confrontations appeared relatively civil. However, as coverage by the media expanded, the rhetoric intensified. To tone down charges of blatant anti-Semitism, the confrontations were termed merely anti-Israel policy actions. Yet, angry demonstrators could be heard spouting anti-Semitic characterizations, some laced with intimidation and others with violent threats. When opportune, property damage and desecration happened. As they were not openly challenged, the perpetrators of this anti-Jewish and anti-Israel actions grew bolder and acted as if the First Amendment rights gave them an entitlement to target Jews, particularly those wearing clothes traditionally identified as Jewish. These unfortunate people became targets of opportunity for the anti-Semites. Jewish students appeared bereft of the justice offered to other discriminated groups under Title VI of the U.S. Civil Rights Act of 1964. This formally prohibited discrimination based on race, color, or national origin, not specifically recognized as acts of religious discrimination. Now you have two U.S. representatives, Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, among others, who actively promote their common disdain toward the Israeli Jewish-American relationship. Without apparent filters, anti-Semitic characterizations have fanned the flames of malice toward Jews and toward Israel. Pro-BDS, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions movement, had an instant appeal to other recognizes people who don't like Israel and the Jews. Now, even aspects of the relatively new social justice movement appear to be hijacked by anti-Israel forces. False racist and apartheid accusations were spewed like venom toward Israel and by extension to Jews, an act of hypocrisy coming from black minorities that seek for themselves relief from racist attitudes and actions. And keep in mind, historically, Jewish groups were the greatest supporters of the civil rights movement to help the blacks in the United States. This is no longer true. Too much of today's psychological warfare appears reminiscent of tactics employed by Nazi Germany during the 1930s against vulnerable populations, primarily the Jews, which eventually led to the Holocaust without any meaningful objection from anybody else. Now, the Palestinian Authority also joined radical Islam and other determined hostile groups, and Jews have found themselves with very few friends openly advocating for the Jewish rights and protection of Jews. Jews appear once again to be in danger and may be vulnerable, particularly on college campuses in the United States. Now, I think that history will not be favorable to the current American political leaders until they promptly correct the strong perception that they have abandoned the Jews and also Israel. They are deferring to a demanding population that in a matter of time may likely turn against the United States itself. And I think this is fairly true. I watched this week the riots that took place in the United States. I saw the reaction to the case that was held in Minnesota about for the ex-policeman who killed a black. And these groups are not resting, even after the jury convicted the ex-policeman. The rioters didn't slow down as one would have expected, and a lot of people, including members of Congress, were inciting the crowd. The situation in the United States, on the streets of the United States, do not in any way resemble the civil rights movement back in the 1960s, which I remember quite clearly. We have a situation in the United States now where the politicians, and I'm afraid to say even the Democratic Party, are very soft on the rioters. And when I was a kid, everybody I knew voted Democratic. I didn't know any Jewish Republicans. But now it's really difficult for Israel to maintain party support from both the Republicans and the Democrats. The scene in the United States is changing. And first, as far as Israel is concerned, our diplomats have to be careful how they handle this changing scene. And the Jewish population of the United States, most of them who live near the big cities, will find themselves in a difficult situation. Many Jews, for example, have businesses in the large cities in the United States, and these are under attack by rioters and people who are taking advantage of the disarray to rob and steal and destroy. So this is a dangerous time, I believe, for the Jewish population in the United States. If it sounds like I'm exaggerating, try to compare in your mind the situation in the United States 5 years ago or before, or even a year ago. The streets of the urban areas of the United States are no longer safe. Businesses are no longer safe. Going on the subway in New York City is no longer safe. So we are approaching a very difficult time for Jews in the United States. And as far as our relationship with the American government, the fact that the Biden administration is trying to kowtow to the Iranians who threaten Israel and who support the terrorist groups near Israel, these are not good news. This is not good news for the Jews in America nor the relationship between Israel and the United States. I'm not an expert on foreign affairs, but I read the papers, I watch television, I listen to the radio, and I think that we are approaching, or we are already in a difficult time, a really difficult time for our relationship with the American government and with the American population. I don't want to be too uh, uh, bringing bad news, but that's how I see it. I'll be back after the break.
Hi, everyone. This is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together, we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. I want to talk about something which is I believe to the listeners to this program, it's pretty much under the radar, and you don't think much about it. I'm talking about the fact that the Suez Canal was blocked up for about a week or 2 weeks by a huge container ship that grounded crosswise. So it influenced the transit of goods that arrived by sea from the Far East, and pretty much caused the world to realize that the dependence on the canal is almost without precedence. Ports in Europe remained empty while waiting for ships that were stuck or for those that chose the long way around of the Cape of Good Hope. For the world's supply chain, this was a wake-up call, and the European ports were left empty will have a massive overload when ships start arriving all at once. Now, that is as far as Europe is concerned. But on the other hand, Israel was only marginally affected by the traffic jam, at least concerning imports from the Far East, despite the almost complete dependence on the Suez Canal for arriving goods. Now, concerning exports from Israel, the story is totally different, and that's what I want to mention, something which I was unaware of. Almost all consumer goods in Israel are imported from the Far East and include, among other things, electrical appliances, clothing, furniture, shoes, dried and frozen food, and in effect, everything that's imported from the Far East, including goods for industry, arrives by means of container shipping lines. As a result of the Suez Canal being blocked, all these shipments have suffered delays up to 2 weeks on their way to Israel. Some of these goods still haven't reached Israel because they have to come by a roundabout route, and they were offloaded at replacement ports like in Italy. In total, the delays on imports from the East are estimated some 3 weeks in the worst cases. Now, this is not something that will critically affect the Israeli importers, who don't work on stocks of 2 weeks in advance, but they rather look forward for at least half a year. Now, what I wanted to talk about after this introduction is the effect of the Suez Canal's blockage from a different direction that has to do with the Israeli exports to the United States. Keep in mind, Israel is a country that relies very heavily on imports and exports. The lines that run from India through the Suez Canal generally stop off at Haifa, here in Israel, and there they load up and they go directly to the United States. So these lines served for loading export items from Israeli ports to the American market. As a result of the traffic jam in the Suez Canal, the primary line that does this skipped Haifa on its way to the U.S. So what happened was, the result, Israel export lost its fast line towards America. So for 3 weeks, exports to the United States from Israel were delayed and suffered from long waiting times. Some of the exporters could not meet their schedule vis-a-vis the American importers for supplying the goods that they had committed to. And this is not a minor matter. The fast shipping line from Haifa port to the U.S. is responsible for, among other things, transportation of agricultural products. In order for the goods to reach American markets while they're still fresh, they need to be sent via the fast line, which takes about 10 days from Haifa to ports in the United States. Now, even the slightest delays will result in these Israeli goods not being able to be sold. For example, an Israeli farmer who had guaranteed supply to an American retail chain could have chosen one of two possibilities. First, he should give up on the deal because he can't ship his goods and look for other markets if he can find them. Or second, shipping via air freight, which significantly raises the cost of the shipments. So we shouldn't forget that as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, air freight capacity has been reduced. So this alternative, sending by plane, didn't provide a full solution for these exporters, many of whom are exporting perishable goods, food. Even the other shipping lines that take some 20 days between Israel and the United States and are meant for less sensitive goods are also affected, because these lines filled up rapidly and many exporters experienced very significant delays. In other words, Israel is exporting a lot of things. Some of the things will not spoil and the time will not matter that they're being shipped. The only thing that would matter, of course, is not meeting the arrival dates, which they're committed to. But Israel is an exporter of agricultural goods, and agricultural goods can rot if they're not shipped in time. So, considering that the effect on the arrival of goods from Asia to Israel wasn't significant, you have to remember that nonetheless, there was a delay of 2 weeks. What would have happened if the canal had been blocked for half a year, for example? Currently, the commercial shipping lines to Israel cannot serve as an alternative to the canal. Cars and freight shipments arrive in Eilat mainly on relatively small ships. That port, Eilat's infrastructure, is not prepared to receive giant ships, only medium and small ones. So this, plus the fact that the port is located far from the center of the country, that is, Eilat is far from the center of the country, and the costs of transferring containers from there by land are high, this makes this option almost not viable. Today, there is already land transportation that goes through Saudi Arabia or via Aqaba in Jordan, but they only allow a limited transfer of containers and cannot serve as a replacement for the Suez Canal. Now, a lot has been said about future peace agreements with Saudi Arabia, and maybe they'll be signed. And if they are, rail lines will be laid down from the ports in Dubai to Haifa ports, and that there will be a solution down the road. However, that'll take many years to be implemented, and it cannot supply a suitable alternative to the quantity of goods that come by sea. It's interesting, by the way, some 5,000 containers arrive in Israel from Asia every week. That's an interesting number. I never knew about that till I saw this article. A train will be able to handle only hundreds of containers instead of thousands, and therefore will not be able to serve as a substitute route. Today, some 95% of the goods arrive in Israel arrive and leave by sea. 95%. So we have Israel is facing difficulty because of the what the Suez blockage did, but it also the fact that this occurred is a wake-up call for Israel to rethink how it can get goods imported and exported. Now they're talking, one of the solutions that could be an alternative for importing goods from the East would be Turkey, but our relationship with Turkey is not too good at the moment. Already at the start of the COVID-19 epidemic, when China was closed to the rest of the world, massive imports from Turkey began as an alternative to China. Israel did this, so did other countries. The Turkish market manufactures almost all the types of goods that are imported from the East. So even more important, the arrival times via shipping lines are set regular and faster than those in the East. So the cost of Turkish goods is higher than those in China. But in a world of abundance, always be someone who will pay for that. That's one thing. So the bottom line is what I'm saying is those Israelis who produce goods for export, and when I say goods, I mean perishable goods, and that's a lot. You know, Israel agriculture is one of its main hard dollar earners. And the closing of the Suez is a wake-up call that as long as we are an agriculturally rich country and we rely on the hard currency earned by the export of agriculture, we have a wake-up call. They're going to have to figure out alternatives on how to export these perishable goods from the country. So the Suez blockage didn't get big headlines in most of Israel. Everybody figured, it happened to the Egyptians and it may harm the Europeans, but it turns out that it's time for Israel to realize we have to make sure that we are able to export dollar-earning perishable goods. Our government has to give a lot of thinking. I'll be back after the break.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
And me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
Hello, I am Walter Bingham. If you want to hear the news behind the news and the true perspective on world affairs, then the Walter Bingham File is the program for you. We bring you interviews with the movers and shakers, political commentaries, and on-the-spot reports of events as they happen. All here every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Israel time, 9 a.m. Eastern time. And it's all archived on our website. Make it a date.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro. If time permits, I want to discuss several items on this final part of the program. The first item is one which I have discussed before, but I really and truly believe that it requires repeating over and over again, so people should be aware. What the item is the following. The United States is restoring over $250 million to the Palestinians. Instead of willingly providing the Palestinians with a financial windfall, the United States should have demanded the cessation of the Palestinian Authority's practice of paying terrorists before the United States gives them any funds. According to Palestine Media Watch, the Awadi family, who are serving life sentence in an Israeli prison, have received $1,200 a month. With the new raise, they'll now get $1,800 per month. That's an example. The Palestinian Authority practice of rewarding terrorists who attack Israelis by remunerating their families through this infamous pay-to-slay system is abhorrent and unconscionable. Irrespective of whether the Palestinian Authority compensates families of incarcerated terrorists based on the length of their prison sentence or on their financial well-being, the underlying structure of these terrible payments is predicated on venerating and praising terrorists and thus espousing further violence. The Palestinian Authority's program not only condones terrorism, it insensitizes it, and the incitement plays a deadly role in what's happening here in the Middle East. It encourages terrorism. And an inordinate amount of money has been squandered over the past years on terror-related expenditures through this outrageous terrorist compensation program. The Palestinian Authority may have paid as much as $181 million just in the year 2020. It was recently acknowledged by the Palestinian Liberation Organization's Commissioner for Prisoners' Affairs. Approximately 7,500 Palestinian terrorists released from prison received payments, as well as 4,500 others who are still in jail in Israeli prisons. Over 7% of the Palestinian Authority budget goes toward this pay-to-slay system. A law in 2018 here in Israel that requires Israel to deduct the cost of the terrorist salaries from the tax revenues it collects monthly for the Palestinian Authority has not deterred the Palestinian Authority from continuing its program, thus signaling that the Mahmoud Abbas and his government would rather pay terrorists than accept much-needed funds that they could theoretically use to improve the lives of ordinary Palestinians. There's no doubt that the Palestinian Authority leadership skims what it wants off the top for themselves and their families, but the average Palestinian suffers. Furthermore, the Taylor Force Act, which was named for an American military veteran murdered by Palestinian terrorists in Tel Aviv in 2016, explicitly prohibits the United States from providing monetary assistance that directly benefits the Palestinian Authority unless it revokes its pay-to-slay system. The whole idea is to curb terrorism. Despite the restrictions on foreign aid that result from compensating terrorists, the Palestinian Authority has refused to end this contemptible practice. Now, the announcement now that under the Biden administration, the United States is restoring By the way, the restoration is taking place is because the Trump administration stopped giving money to the Palestinian Authority as long as they were paying the terrorists. So the announcement that the U.S. is restoring approximately $250 million to the Palestinians raises very serious questions. Why should the United States send such a substantial amount of money when the Palestinian Authority continues paying terrorists? Why would they send $150 million through the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which has a long and troubling history of engaging in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel behavior? And they also run the school system that trains, that teaches little kids, inculcates in little kids the idea that the state of Israel has no right to exist and it's okay to kill Jews. The UNRWA has a long and troubling history of engaging in anti-Semitic and anti-Israel behavior. Why would the United States not insist on a commitment from the Palestinian Authority to end its incitement of terrorism and demand that Palestinian schools stop indoctrinating students with anti-Semitic and anti-Israel sentiments? A friend of mine, David Bedin, has done a very, very detailed study on the education within the Palestinian Authority school system, and it's mind-boggling how these kids are being educated, or a better word would be brainwashed, to believe that the state of Israel has no right to exist and Jews have no rights to life. Moreover, how is the U.S. sending money to the Palestinians in light of the Taylor Force Act? Even if the funds are not sent directly to the Palestinian Authority, the money is going to all kinds of Palestinian entities and organizations that have direct ties to the Palestinian Authority and may very well operate simply as an extension of the Palestinian Authority. Until such time as the Palestinian Authority stops glorifying martyrdom and lionizing terrorists, it must be taken to task by the international community. The termination of the Palestinian Authority's government-sanctioned sponsorship of terrorism must be a prerequisite before any more foreign aid dollars can flow to the Palestinians. And in particular, as I said, a tremendous amount of this money comes essentially from the American taxpayer. And I'm quite sure that the average American taxpayer has no idea how this money is being sent. So inaction in the face of this shameful practice is really, it's a moral malpractice, and it's a dereliction of diplomatic duty. And these are the facts, and I sort of hesitate to repeat them again. I know I've spoken about them before, but I think many of the listeners to this program are in the United States, and I think they have a right to know how their tax money is being spent. It is specifically being spent to encourage terrorism. And I don't think that sits well with the average American, or at least it shouldn't. I want to close the program on a positive note. Israel passed two important milestones in the battle against COVID-19 this week. More than a year after the public was directed to wear masks outdoors, the regulation was rescinded. People can now walk the streets of the country's cities with their mouths and noses exposed, just like they used to. On the same day, the vast majority of the country's school children returned to school. No more Zoom, no more parental admonishments to children to get back to their screens, no more being cooped up in a room with a computer. Back to school. at least for 2 months until the summer vacation, which is very good, really. But with that vigilance, we should all recognize that our situation compared to the rest of the world is really pretty good. Israel has the highest percentage of fully vaccinated people in the world. Its economy shrank last year less than that of the U.S. or the average of UE countries, and the COVID-19 morbidity rate of 689 per million people is significantly less than most of the other developed countries. All that is good news and explains why Israel is now able to begin to returning to normal, or what's considered to be normal in Israel. I'm not quite sure that is. So it's time to enjoy it for as long as we can. Having said all that, thanks for listening. This is Jay Shapiro. Take care of yourselves till next week. And signing off.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.